Hi, everyone. I'm going to discuss the book of Isaiah today. Isaiah is one of my favorite books of the Old Testament, and I think it's really important that we understand that the book is authentic and it was authored by the authors who were always historically in ancient times revered for authorship of that book, Isaiah. So Isaiah the prophet is the one who authored Isaiah. Now, there is a present debate going on the Myth Vision channel, and this debate is between four different people. There are who are representing two different sides. So we have Emma Wingate and Jonathan Sheffield representing the authenticity of Isaiah in the debate question of did Isaiah predict the coming of Cyrus? And then we have Matthew Monger and Kip Davis representing the atheist side, and they are claiming that there were multiple authors who contributed to Isaiah, and they contributed at the same time as some of the events that they talked about. In other words, atheists come in with the presupposition that Isaiah could not have possibly prophesied because they believe that that would involve God, and they don't believe in God. So they come in with the presupposition. And I actually have proof that this is the presupposition by this one statement right here by Dr. Monger. Okay, so let's listen in. Note the built-in presupposition.
Theoretical questions about textual scholarship might be related to epistemology and ontology, how to define methods that we're using. Asking questions like, what can a text tell me about history? How can text be dated? What does a text say about God? But my personal scholarly position is that artifacts, including textual artifacts, are best studied within the historical context of their production and use. So whenever we attempt to move backwards in time from artifacts that we have, the weight of the burden of proof increases. So saying something about the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts in their historical setting is, in my opinion, a much more fruitful endeavor than saying something about the so.
I have to pause this for just a moment. I realize I've got this turned on a little fast, and I want him to be able to speak at his own speed. So let me just change that really quickly, get back to a normal speed. Here we go.
Old origin of Isaiah. Because of this skepticism of stepping backwards into history, I'm extremely interested in the methods that are used and how they're justified and interpreted. And as far as I'm concerned, the primary interest of scholars is to develop robust methodologies that are testable and repeatable for any text, and not just for text within a single religious canon. So what I'm discussing here could be used on any range of texts, though I am exemplifying it through Isaiah. So one of the biggest challenges in doing this work in general is that we have to take into use a variety of methods in order to say anything at all. We have to deal with manuscripts. We have to discuss textual and linguistic details. We have to examine historical references. We have to take into account scribal practices and compositional techniques of antiquity. We also have to disentangle all of this from our own presuppositions about writing and authorship.
This is where it gets amusing.
So a common method for dating a text would be to establish limits for the possible writing of the text by finding its earliest secured witness on the one hand and the latest possible time of writing on the other. So using the methods from manuscript studies and paleography, Kip has already discussed the manuscript evidence for Isaiah, and we can draw.
What Kip did was, Kip's an expert in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and thankfully we have a full scroll. The Great Isaiah Scroll has all 66 chapters of Isaiah in that particular scroll. So Kip, rather than presenting so much that, focused on other scrolls where they've only had parts of the scrolls retained. And one of the problems with that method is it's highly selective and it's not terribly honest, because if you wanted to talk to what we have in Isaiah, talk to the Great Isaiah Scroll that includes all 66. In fact, just so you know, the Great Isaiah Scroll does make reference to King Cyrus, makes reference very specifically, you can find in Isaiah 44:28 and Isaiah 45. So the Great Isaiah Scroll, the Dead Sea Scroll, did reference King Cyrus, named him quite specifically, and so you can go back and reference that. I have a link to the English translation of this in the description, which you can go to, and you can find that. But listen here very carefully to what Matthew says.
There are two conclusions based on that. One, Isaiah was copied in what is now the canonical length during.
He has to date the earliest, of course, to be the time when the Dead Sea Scroll was discovered. Had the Dead Sea Scrolls not been discovered, who knows what date they would come up with.
The 2nd century BCE. And two, Isaiah was also copied in smaller parts and sections during the 2nd century BCE, including the divisions of say 1 to 33 and the later portion of the book. This means that in the 2nd century BCE, we have a terminus ante quem, also a time before which Isaiah must have been written. So basically, we could stop there. Isaiah must have been written before the mid-2nd century BCE.
Because
Everything else means projecting meaning into a time previous to the copying of the existing manuscripts. That makes it tenuous, and it requires different methods. So one way to do this, and that scholars generally would use, is to find datable historical events or features described or alluded to in the text so that we can know the latest possible time in which a text was written.
There you go. See exactly what he said there. He is saying that he is looking for events in the text so that when the event occurred, the person must have been writing after that time. So in other words, this particular method rules out the potential for any prophecies, and he's admitted it right there, flat-faced admitted it. And so that's what they've got. They come in with the presupposition that the text couldn't have possibly been written prior to it because that would, again, involve God. I did have to say, I think Emma Wingate surprised me. I've never heard her before. Very, very impressive young woman. Jonathan Sheffield, he always does a great job. They both talked about some of the very important facts surrounding Isaiah, such as the fact that to posit when Isaiah was all around the Hebrew world, copies of Isaiah would have been north, south, east, west, as Emma said. She said it's absurd to think that suddenly someone came in and made a bunch of insertions and made these insertions in later years, and nobody seemed to notice. That's one of my arguments as well. And I also have to note her other argument saying Josephus, Ben Siri, and Philo also gave reference in ancient times to Isaiah's authorship. But there's much more. So let me begin here by talking a little bit about the thorn in atheist's side. Around 700 years prior to Jesus' birth, the prophet Isaiah stated that he would come from a stump of Jesse in 11:1, in the line of King David and the tribe of Judah. He would be born of a virgin in 7:14 and would be called Emmanuel, which means God with us, and an everlasting Father, a wonderful counselor, and a Prince of Peace in Isaiah 9:6. Micah 5:2 prophesied that he would be born in Bethlehem, while Hosea revealed that out of Egypt God called his son. As our suffering servant, he would be scourged and beaten beyond recognition, as in Isaiah 52:13-14, and rejected by his own people in Isaiah 53:3, and pierced for our transgressions, Isaiah 53:5. Despite the beatings and tremendous pain, he wouldn't cry out. Rather, he would suffer in silence, according to Isaiah 53:7. He would be buried with the rich, Isaiah 53:9. Before the Lord prolonged his days, and he saw the light, Isaiah 53:10-11. All of these came true. The prophet Isaiah lived between 769 and 686 BC, while the first Jewish temple was standing. Yet he prophesied about its destruction, which occurred in 586 BC, and the call to rebuild it, which began around 537 BC. He even named the person whom God ordained to issue the decree to rebuild decades later. Here's what he said in Isaiah 44:28, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation will be laid. The foundation was laid in 535 BC. Many prophecies were fulfilled in the Bible, which provides us with evidence of its validity, and divine inspiration is the Word of God and the Word of God. Therein lies the problem for the atheist who believes divine inspiration isn't possible. Since the 1700s, Bible scholars in Western universities have addressed this uncomfortable truth by weaving complex webs that have attempted to change traditional views on the scholarship and timing of books in the Bible. All of their presuppositions are based on the same underlying presupposition: prophecies are impossible. Accordingly, they claim Isaiah couldn't have written the prophecy of Cyrus over 100 years in advance. Someone else must have written that prophecy during Cyrus's reign. You see there? You see the circular reasoning that they apply. The example of Isaiah is one of many. Some scholars claim that the Gospels couldn't have been written prior to 70, since Jesus predicted the fall of the Second Temple, which occurred in 70 AD. Moses couldn't have written Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26 about the Hebrew exiles and punishments, since he had lived before they happened. Daniel couldn't have possibly predicted the four kingdoms of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, or the abomination of desolation in 165 by Antiochus Epiphanes, since he lived well before they happened. And surely Isaiah couldn't have written about the fall of the first temple, or that King Cyrus would release the Jews from exile under the Babylonians way before Cyrus was born, or Babylon came to power. Certainly, these scholars may have mused, these books must have been written over hundreds of years by multiple authors and editors who somehow duped ancient Jews and Christians into believing the books were prophetic by single authors who wrote in their own times and worthy of incorporation into the Holy Scriptures. You see what's going on here? It's rather pathetic. And so I want to say hi to people in the chat. I see Mr. Phil Fox, XR Tito, Taking Back Eden. Great to see you guys. Hope you're doing wonderfully today. We're going to talk a little bit about some reasons. Now, here's what Jesus said. If there's no other information that's out there and you trust Jesus, here's what he said. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. That's in John 5:46. He attributed the books of the Pentateuch to Moses. And then Luke 24:44. Then he said to them, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Here's what he said of Daniel in Matthew 24:15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Okay, so what they do is they split out the book into three different sections, and they split it out claiming that there's a Deutero section, which is the second. The first Isaiah book, according to them, is 1 to 39, chapters 1 to 39. Deutero, or second Isaiah, is what they claim, books 40 to 55, and Trito, or third Isaiah, books 56 to 65. Isaiah placed himself in history in his 39 books, which speak of God as our creator, who righteously judges and condemns sins in places such as Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, Tyre, Judah, and Israel. In the books to follow, 40 to 66, Isaiah detailed our suffering servant, God's mercy and comfort, his vicarious atonement for our sin, his victory over death, and his offer of salvation as light for all nations. In its final books, he also included insight about the end times, which align with Ezekiel, Daniel, and the book of Revelations. Note how the 66 chapters we now use to distinguish parts in Isaiah align with the 66 chapters of the Bible, or books of the Bible. The first 39 books contain the Old Testament and its passages about God's righteous judgment and condemnation for sins, while the 27 books of the New Testament contain passages about Jesus' mercy, vicarious atonement, vicarious redemption, the Great Commission to share the light and love of Jesus with all nations, and our hope for the future. Okay, so that is a deal. So we've got a lot of evidence within Isaiah that's pretty important. Isaiah self-identifies quite a bit. So let's just think about this. We're going to go into some of the prophecies. So let us go to that. Isaiah, for who was he? Let's first talk about who he was. He was the son of Amos, is considered one of the greatest prophets of the Bible with some of the most significant prophecies. He was very faithful to the Lord and humble in spirit. And you can compare that, of course, with 2 Kings 19 and 2 Chronicles 32. He began his ministry in Judah, following God's call to him in Isaiah 6. He was married to a woman he referred to as the prophetess, though we do not have a record of her prophecies. They had two sons with the symbolic names of Shear-Jeshub, which is in Isaiah 7:3, and Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz in Isaiah 8:3. Shear-Jeshub means a remnant shall return, while Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz means the spoil speeds, the prey hastens. Isaiah's name also has a symbolic meaning. Yahweh is salvation. The kings who reigned in Judah during Isaiah's time when Assyria was in power included King Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, and Manasseh. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah recount his experiences during this time period, starting with his calling in a temple in the year that King Uzziah died. That's in Isaiah 6, 1-4. King Uzziah was one of the rare kings of his time who almost always did what was right in the eyes of the Lord in his 52-year reign. At the end of his reign, however, he became very prideful, and he committed an unpardonable sin by acting as a high priest in the temple, which led to his demise via leprosy. King Uzziah's early years of righteousness stood in stark contrast to King Manasseh, who was probably one of Judah's most evil kings. He worshiped the god Baal, murdered many innocent people, sacrificed his own son by fire, and made the people of Judah also commit evil. Tradition and the New Testament suggest that Isaiah met his fate under King Manasseh. The author of the book of Hebrews spoke of the torture and wrath that had been inflicted on the prophets of the past, stating that some were sawn in two. Tradition said that Isaiah was put into a tree trunk and sawn in two by King Manasseh. Isaiah was a brave prophet who knew his humble place before God, yet he was willing to serve him despite paying the ultimate price. Ancient world was like Minecraft in real life, where people routinely expanded their kingdoms by destroying and plundering people, cities, and kingdoms. Some warrior strategists who plundered kingdoms in the ancient Near East enslaved, killed, and carted their captives into exile hundreds of miles away from their home. No one would want to suffer such a fate, so the ancient people built tall and thick fortified walls around their cities and stationed them with full-time guard posts. So one of the really interesting things, there's several facts that are quite interesting that were predicted by Isaiah. So we can go back to Babylon to start. Isaiah was before the time of Babylon. But in Babylon, 5 classical historians, Herodotus, Strabo, Cetus, Clitarchus, and Quintus, Curtius, Rufus, differed in their size estimates of Babylonian walls, which were exaggerated according to modern excavations. But they were still thick and sturdy. Those who planned to penetrate them had to devise clever means, as evidenced in Babylon and Jericho, which were according to God's plans. For example, the Babylonian king Belshazzar, this is when Daniel was around, was conquered and killed when Medo-Persian forces diverted the Euphrates River, which ran under the walls surrounding Babylon. The Old Testament recorded these conquering adventures with successions of empires and claims of dominance. The idea of dominance over people groups was highly valued in ancient times, as were the kings who could squash other empires. Ancient kings often bragged about their conquests in propagandist records, as if might always make right. And the wealthy and strong were always superior to the meek, unhealthy, and poor. This mindset is evidenced in ancient cylinders, archaeology, and the Old Testament's ancient empires. As an example, the Cyrus cylinder details Cyrus's propaganda about himself. King Cyrus was a Persian whose empire overtook Babylonians in 539 BC. Here's what he says. He says, I am Cyrus, king of the world, the great king, the powerful king of Babylon, king of Sumer, Akkad, king of the 4 quarters of the world, son of Cambyses, the great king of the city of Ashan, grandson of Cyrus, the great king of the city of Anshan, great-grandson of Tispes, the great king of the city of Anshan, eternal sing of royalty, whose Bel and Nabu love, in whose administration they rejoice in their heart. Old Testament prophets were particularly adept in predicting changes in rule between empires, as evidenced time and again in the prophetic writings of Isaiah, Daniel, Jeremiah, and more. So here's some evidence of what Isaiah said. He talked about the Babylonian destruction of Assyria. Isaiah lived under Assyrian rule. Here's what he said in Isaiah 14, 24 to 25. And this occurred around 609 BC, well after Isaiah lived. Quote, the Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so shall it be. As I have purposed, so shall it stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot, and his yoke shall depart from them, and his burden from their shoulder. Here's what he also said in Isaiah 31, 8 to 9. And the Assyrian shall fall by a sword, not of man in a sword, not of man shall devour him. And he shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall be put into forced labor. His rock shall pass away in terror, and his officers desert the standard in panic, declares the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, and whose furnace is in Jerusalem. Then, here's in Isaiah 39, again, he's giving these warnings, very significant. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming, when all that is in your house, and that which your fathers have stored up till this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord, and some of your own sons, who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the place of the king of Babylon. Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good." For he thought, "There will be peace and security in my days." See how selfish Hezekiah was. And we also have the reference from Isaiah 37, 36 to 38. And the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, there were all dead bodies. The Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. And he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god. Adramelech and Sharezer, his sons, struck him down with the sword. And after they escaped into the land of Ararat, Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his place. Another prophet in the years to follow Isaiah's time was Jeremiah. He predicted that the Hebrews would serve Babylon for 70 years. And of course, that's exactly what happened. We can see it starting right around 609 to 605 and ending right around 539 to 535. But I digress. I want to focus a little bit more on what else Isaiah said. So I want to say hi to people in the chat. I'm going to get back to that debate in just a second, but I want to make sure you know why they're so crazy with this positing that Isaiah was written by multiple authors who somehow were able to slip into the ancient world, find all of the different editions, all the different versions, all the different, not really that there's editions and versions, but all the different copies, I should say, of these books of the Bible and slip in new material. It's ridiculous to think that that's what could be possible, but that's what they're positing. Here's what Isaiah, he also predicted the Babylonian destruction of the first temple around 586 BC. Here's what he said in Isaiah 63, 18 to 19. Your holy people held possession for a little while. Our adversaries have trampled down your sanctuary. That's the first temple. We have become like those over whom you have never ruled, like those who are not called by your name. Then in Isaiah 64, 10 to 11, your holy cities have become a wilderness. Zion has become a wilderness. Jerusalem, a desolation. Our holy and beautiful house, where our fathers praised you, has been burned by fire, and all our pleasant places have become ruins. Then Isaiah predicted the Mede and Persian rise to power. Now, this speaks to King Cyrus. He specifically named King Cyrus. That is one of the reasons why the atheists in this debate had the presupposition that that can't be possible because they don't believe in God, but especially the specificity of this particular prediction. Here's what it says in Isaiah 47:11. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Now remember, it goes Assyria, then Babylon, then Medo-Persia, then Greece. That was the process. That was the order in which the kingdoms were the kingdoms. So it says, O virgin daughter of Babylon, sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, but evil shall come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away. Disaster shall fall upon you, for which you will not be able to atone. And ruin shall come upon you suddenly, of which you know nothing. That's again Isaiah 47:11. Isaiah 13:17 to 19 says, Behold, I am stirring up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver and who do not delight in gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men. They will have mercy, no mercy, on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. Interestingly, we found some ancient evidence recently, archaeological evidence of Sodom and Gomorrah, which I've tweeted on my thing. So Isaiah 20, 9 to 10. You're going to notice these prophecies are so sprinkled throughout the book of Isaiah that the atheist who's positing that prophecies can't happen really gets into a fluster and starts getting into this point where, okay, we're just going to pull out all of these different prophecies, put them into the time in which the event occurred, and claim that other authors, some students of Isaiah, inserted them, went and found all the different copies of Isaiah all around Judah, all around the areas where the Israelites had been occupying, and somehow inserted these into all of these different versions. I shouldn't say versions, I should say copies again. So Isaiah 29 to 10. And behold, here come the riders, horsemen in pairs. And he answered, Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of her God he has shattered to the ground. O my threshold, my threshed and winnowed one, what I have heard from the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I announce to you. And it goes on. So also you're going to want to look at Isaiah's passages like Isaiah 40, 20 to 23. Okay, again, talking about how Babylon's going to go into destruction. Now here's where he names King Cyrus, Isaiah 45, 1-5. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exiled places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides, there is no God. Now recall, Cyrus was worshiping a different God, and that's why he said, you do not know me. But he's calling him. He called him by name. So we know that Cyrus reigned with King Darius the Mede, and they reigned and was reported under the book of Daniel. We also have the rebuilding predicted by Isaiah, the rebuilding of the temple, the second temple. Now, again, when Isaiah was living, the first temple was up and it had not even been trampled down. Over 100 years later, the thing was knocked down. But here's what he says about it being rebuilt. He says, Isaiah 27, 12-13, in that day, from the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt, the Lord will thresh out the grain, and you will be gleaned, one by one, O people of Israel. And in that day, a great trumpet will be blown, and those who were lost in the land of Assyria and those who were driven out of the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem. Isaiah 27. Isaiah 14, 1-2. For the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel and will set them in their own land. And sojourners will join them and will attach themselves to the house of Jacob. And the peoples will take them and bring them down to their place. And the house of Israel will possess them in the Lord's land as male and female slaves. They will take captive those who were their captors and rule over those who oppressed them. So just remember, when the northern kingdom went into captivity under Assyria, and the southern kingdom, Judah, went into captivity under Babylon. One of the things that the Assyrians and the Babylonians did is they took the people away from Jerusalem and took them into their own lands. So that was just something pretty specific that was done by them. Now, Josephus, and this was, of course, mentioned also by Emma, Josephus very specifically recounted a few things about Isaiah and referred to Isaiah as a prophet. So there's some pretty interesting things with that. One of the other things that you're going to notice about the book of Isaiah is the way that it talks a lot about in symbolism about trees, and it repeats a lot of the same phrases. So that's just something to think about. You see the same phrase repeated again and again, like the right arm of the Lord and the strong mighty arm and that kind of a thing. So what I'm going to get to here is I want to get to one more thing to mention to you. I'll say hi to people in the chat. I see I have. So Sam Harris says, I have come to believe that Isaiah has 3 authors, but I wouldn't think it's a forgery. I think the later authors were students of Isaiah who resumed his work. Yeah, that's the thing that some of these atheists are positing, although we have no ancient support for that notion. The only support that we have comes from an obscure passage by Ibn Ezra in the medieval times, in well after Christ walked, well after Isaiah wrote this. And so that's just something to consider. Now, Sam Harris, are you the Sam Harris that wrote that book on morality, on objective morality, by chance? If you can let me know that. I also see Taking Back Eden, and I see Eris 106, which is pretty good to see. So one of the things that we're going to notice in the book of Isaiah is also, I want to get into the geography because I think that's a pretty strong argument. I'm just trying to find, I've got on that in here. Okay. I'll mention also literary devices because that was also mentioned in this debate. So Isaiah revealed the Lord's plan by weaving together a brilliant web of literary devices, which include similes, metaphors, poetry, imagery, personification, repetition, and more. They convey messages of judgment, prophecy, hope, reconciliation, comfort, vicarious atonement, redemption, and victory. They're sprinkled all throughout Isaiah's book. The list below is not exhaustive. What I'm going to say to you is not exhaustive, but there's just a few references. You can find them in all 3 supposed sections of Isaiah. That's what's interesting. For example, you see the mountains and the house of the Lord, which is metaphorical. For example, here's a passage in Isaiah 2. And it shall come to pass in the latter days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills. And all the nations shall flow into it, and many people shall come and say, Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that he may walk in his paths. For out of Zion go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. That's in Isaiah 2, 2-3. Now you can see similar passages in Isaiah 18:7 and 57:13. Also, we've got references to garments and armor in places like Isaiah 8, 9-10, Isaiah 11:5, Isaiah 59:17, 59:19, 60:8-9, and 61:10. So just notice again, all throughout Isaiah. We have the light and darkness, lots of references to that. Isaiah 2:5, 9:2, 42:16, 49:6, and 61. The clay and the potter, you can see that in Isaiah 29:16, 45:9, 64:8, and it also is referenced in Romans by Paul in Romans 9, 19-21. And then there, of course, are the weather elements in Isaiah 9, 18-19, 10:22, 48, 20-22, and 57, 19-21. Now, I'm not being exhaustive of all these, but we can just see again lots of literary devices that Isaiah used. He used repetition. He spoke of things like a number of other things. So that's one argument, the literary device argument. Another one is looking at the geography that he included. Okay, so we see the formula Zion, Jerusalem, which describes the entire city, temple, and living quarters, is present in all three sections of Isaiah, with a distribution that is surprisingly even. Now, that's from a scholar who's called it surprisingly even. In the latter parts of his book, 40-66, if they were written during or following the Babylonian captivity over 100 years later, the geographic features mentioned in the latter books should be consistent with those in Babylon, which is around 900 miles east and slightly north of Jerusalem, but they aren't. Among his geographic inclusions are mentions of 1, multiple references to Zion, Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. 2, references to Babylon as there rather than here, and to Jerusalem and Zion as places where people will come rather than go. 3, specific types of trees and valleys and plains around where he resided in Judah. 4, mentions to only 3 of the 4 plants used in the Sukkot, which may be because the citron had likely not been imported from northern India by that point. 5, there's many mentions of mountains and hills. Judah is mountainous, whereas Babylon is a flatland. 6, the presence of places that are either rarely named or not named in later books of the Old Testament. 7, the absence of places that surround Babylon in the 8th to 6th centuries BC. And 8, the pre-Babylonian exile spelling of King David's name. Okay, so there's just lots of stuff in Isaiah that gives it it gives us the credibility of having been written much later. Now, I'm going to zoom ahead here a little bit to get to this question and answer session between the 4 of them, because I thought that some of this was rather telling. So here we go. Again, this is Emma Wingate and Jonathan Sheffield. They're 2 Christians. Then you have Kip and Matthew, and they are 2 atheists. So let's listen to what they have to say.
Presented. The other thing is the political reality of the time. So one of the things that interests me when I read Xenophon many years ago, and they got to catch back on him, is Cyrus's institution of the king's eyes and ears. And obviously, I understand from a political standpoint the importance of having information, even today. Now, obviously, Cyrus was rewarding people liberally to get information to protect his interests and the interests of the Persian Empire. Now, the Jews did not only have a number of enemies, given what was happening there, but my question to you, and get your thoughts on this, is while I think there is some agreement, or hopefully, that this proclamation was published sometime in the Persian period after Cyrus, How would have such a
Oh boy, I'm buffering here for some reason. Let's see if we can move ahead. I'll get ahead of this for a second. Uh-oh. Thanks for tuning in. It ended a few minutes ago. Okay. So here we go. Let's just get ahead of this and see if we can get back to it.
All right, everybody. We are live here.
Oops. Now it's buffering and it's got me in the wrong place. I want to get back to where we were. Okay. I hate when we have problems here. All right, let's.
Happens to be the prominent figure throughout the whole manuscript. As I mentioned, the whole text is credited, or I should say, in our modern imagination, the entire text is credited to Isaiah, and this is by virtue of the introduction, which most scholars consider to be a late addition, at the end of this redactional process, and then throughout the text itself, you've got some biographical material dealing with Isaiah in chapters 7 through 9, and then in 36 to 39. But after that, only 3 oracles are explicitly assigned to him. Virtually.
It's not that they're assigned to him. In the beginning, like I mentioned before, we have sort of a history of Isaiah. We have Isaiah saying, "Here I am, so pick me." We've got Isaiah's vision of God, and we've got a little bit about his 2 sons and his wife. So we have some of that kind of stuff in the beginning. Towards the end, it shifts. The passages start talking about comfort and much more about the servant, our Lord and servant, I should say, the suffering servant. So we hear about that. And towards the very end, we start hearing about prophecies. Again, the structure is very similar to the way the Bible's structured.
Really, everything else is, just a general oracle of Yahweh, or a text that really is not provided any authorship. I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that, Matthew?
Yeah, because I just think that it's actually wrong to say that we don't have analogies, because the Pentateuch is an analogy for this. The Deuteronomistic history is also an analogy for this.
In other words, what he's saying is the analogies, the scholars also were very uncomfortable with the idea of the Pentateuch, as I mentioned earlier, because of the passages in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, which were portended by Moses and they came true. Now, in the Pentateuch, we do admit that there are a couple of places where it looks like the person, Aaron, probably added to what Moses had done, especially places where it says that Moses was the most humble man and describing Moses' death. So we know that there was another author. It's not saying the Pentateuch is solely authored by Moses, but we do believe there's plenty of evidence, and I've gone over this with Dr. David Falk on my channel before. Dr. David Falk's an Egyptologist who has looked at the Pentateuch and who has examined its language, because he knows the ancient Near Eastern languages, and he said it's very consistent with what you'd expect during the time period in which Moses lived. But later scholars, they can't deal with that, so they created this theory, the JEPD theory, that there's 4 different authors, and then they have no unifying theory on explaining exactly how those authors put everything together. So anyway, I'm going to skip ahead to a part that I think we need to have more commentary on. I want to get to when Emma asked them questions too. I liked her stuff.
died. And we do see where either in the book of Psalms, Chronicles, and these other works where they are.
Okay, I'm going to get ahead of that and get to this part. Here we go.
Came in after these periods that were not from their prophet.
Okay, so let's look at this question. Maybe I'll back up just a second here to give Jonathan a chance to answer this question. So here we go.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the love. Doc Pluralmanaut. And anyone, if you feel like you got an answer or want to say something, I'm going to have these, unless it's like specifically directed to someone, but maybe you even have something you want to comment on that. Doc Pluralmanaut says, Isaiah ben Amos wrote 2 other works chronicling Uzziah and Hezekiah. Chronicles knows and cites them, yet are never canonized. Why exclude 2 books of history, yet embrace a 3rd work of prophecy? History is an afterthought.
Why exclude 2 books of history?
Now, to answer this question for me, I actually haven't heard of these other 2 works chronicling Uzziah and Hezekiah written by Isaiah. So it'll be interesting to see what Jonathan says.
Well, I'll just answer real quick. on my thought, unless you want to jump in, Kip.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think when we look at the Orthodox Jewish canon, and when we look at what has come down, or at least in the Hellenistic traditions, especially with the Septuagint, you know, we have a number of writings. I mean, I probably asked, while it may know some of these writings, I think the Jewish people, and
Oh boy.
not just to quote Josephus, but Josephus knew of a lot of these other works that came in after these periods that were not from their prophets or their writers. You know, and I think it's important to understand that the Jewish people did feel they had a system where they believed that not only that the canon was closed, but they were able to identify, even with Baruch. We have Baruch's work, there, Jeremiah, but there's other works that have come in to identify with Baruch that is not part of their Orthodox Jewish canon. And I think it does go back to the fact that are the Jews, who are relevant witnesses and guardian of text, understand where their text came from. It seems like in their literature, they did understand where they were getting things from, and they had a system in place, probably even better than the Christians, to organize and know what was coming in. And
Yeah, the Jewish people were very organized. They were known as the people of the book. That's been acknowledged even by atheist agnostic scholars like Bart Ehrman. But to draw your attention to a couple of quotes about Isaiah from the New Testament that also give legitimacy to Isaiah as the prophet who wrote what he wrote, we have Matthew 3:3. For this is the one who is spoken of by the prophet Isaiah when he said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. You can compare that to Isaiah 43. We also have Paul in Romans 10:16 saying, but they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who hath believed and who has heard from us? Now we also have, of course, the story that comes from the book of Acts, Acts 26-38. And I'm going to include this with the omitted verse 8:37. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, rise and go towards the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert place. And he rose and went. And there was an Ethiopian, a eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasure. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning, seated in his chariot, and he was reading the prophet Isaiah. And the Spirit said to Philip, go over and join this chariot. So Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet and said, do you understand what you are reading? And he said, how can I, unless someone guides me? And he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. Now, the passage of the scripture that he was reading, of course, is Isaiah 53. And there's a portion in there that always gets omitted in some versions, English versions. And Philip said, if you believe with all your heart, you may. And he replied, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That is the omitted passage. Also, Jesus directly referenced Isaiah numerous times in the Gospels and attributed the authorship to him. For example, in John 12:36-43, Lord, who hath believed what he heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe. For again, Isaiah said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart, and in turn I would heal them. Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Nevertheless, many, even of the authorities, believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue, for they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. So Josephus also mentioned, we further have references that came in from places such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's a number of different references that you can find in there that also back up Isaiah, also as the prophet, and also as King Cyrus inclusion. Okay, so here we go.
And there.
Yeah, so I might just want to jump in and explain to people what this question is about, in case the viewers out there don't know kind of what the background is. But it's like 2 Chronicles literally says that Isaiah ben Amoz wrote some other stuff. And this is like, so if I can just read from 2 Chronicles 26:22, says, now the remainder of the words of Uzziah, from the first to the last, Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, wrote them. And so that's a citation. And it also happens with Hezekiah. So these are like cited by the Book of Chronicles, by the chronicler, and saying that Isaiah wrote the histories of these. And so how I understand this question is then, I feel like there's an assumption here that these are two books of history, one the history of Uzziah and one the history of Hezekiah, that Isaiah would have written. And so I would dispute that. First, I would say that there probably weren't separate histories written about Uzziah and Hezekiah. I would doubt that there's a reference or a book or an actual document behind this at all. I think this is just the chronicler saying that, oh yeah, we know about the book of Isaiah, and in the book of Isaiah there is reference to the time of Uzziah and Hezekiah, and so it's basically kind of like triangulating his reference and his work, and saying that Isaiah wrote about these dudes, and then some of the stuff that we see in Chronicles is found in Isaiah. So like we do have some intertextuality there that the chronicler does know.
Yeah, the chronicler doesn't. I don't know. I'm having trouble with this video
about
here.
These.
So the chronicler does know about Isaiah, and Jeremiah, of course, knows about Isaiah. They lived after Isaiah. It's debated who exactly the Chronicle author is, 2 Chronicles author is, but both of them made reference to Isaiah as the author because Isaiah preceded them. The simplest explanation for this kind of stuff is that Isaiah was written when he said it was written. You don't have to develop 1,000 theories to try to get past that and to claim that Isaiah was written by all of these people over a long period of time, because it's just not something that makes much sense. And so, yes, Christian Fandom Geek, God is good. And I see thank you, Christian, saying thanks, dude. You guys are going back and forth. So that's all good stuff right there. So let's go back to just sum up some of the evidence that we have for Isaiah being the author of Isaiah. We have evidence from ancient times. We have evidence from Josephus, Ben Siri, Philo. We have evidence in the New Testament in ancient times, making direct reference to Isaiah as a prophet. The Dead Sea Scrolls are calling out to us, referencing Isaiah as a prophet. Other ancient documents from around that time period are calling out to us, which I've mentioned in other videos. We also have the way the geography is in Isaiah that points to Isaiah being a person who lived in Judah, not in Babylon, or under Persian captivity or Persian rule. We also have a lot of, I shouldn't say Persian captivity, but definitely Persian rule. We also have a lot of other evidence from other people. So the ancients have told us that Isaiah is the author. Jesus tells us Isaiah is the author. We see it throughout the books of the New Testament. We see it throughout some old works. We see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The only relatively distant person who thought that Isaiah could have been written by somebody else was someone who lived in the medieval times, Ibn Ezra, who had a very vague passage. Suddenly in 1700s, 1800s, that's when the German scholarship decided that it's not possible that there are fulfilled prophecies in the Old Testament. So they dug through the Old Testament and started making up all kinds of theories that multiple authors during the time when these events were occurring or after the time wrote at that point. And so those theories get really complicated because they don't have a foundation. In other words, there's nothing that unifies them. Dr. David Falk has pointed this out before. So people can say, oh, I think it was written by the school of Isaiah. It was written by people. No, you need to get some backing. And so that's pretty important. They don't have any ancient support. Very important. And even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where Kip is an expert, he's an expert in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you look at Isaiah 1-66 right there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can see that in the Great Isaiah Scroll. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming in here. Please like, subscribe, and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Thank you.